topic that we've talked about from time to time. What law enforcement is able to obtain from your mobile device and what they're not able to obtain without a warrant. And this is a topic of conversation that's come up yet again. And one of the cases that's in the crosshairs of this conversation, one out of Tampa from last year, you had a man who was known by law enforcement, had a record. He was detained by law enforcement. He admitted to them that he had pot in the car. They also found bottles of what they thought was THC. And at the time that he was being detained and arrested, he had two different iPhones, and a text message came up on one of them. And it said, "Oh my God, did they find it?" And from there, law enforcement demanded information to be able to access the phone because it clearly looked like it might have been the hookup, somebody related to drug trafficking. And that's where things come full circle yet again. And here to talk to us about this situation and where that line of demarcation is, Dr. Alex Del Carmen, once again, law enforcement expert. Always good to talk with you. Dr. Del Carmen, so tell us a little bit. This specific situation in Tampa, has a lot of moving pieces to it, but is it still the case that the only way law enforcement can obtain information on a mobile device, if you choose not to give it to them, is if they obtain a warrant?
Good morning, and thanks for having me this morning. Actually, it depends on who you ask, right? So the Supreme Court a couple of years ago actually said it very clearly that the expectation of privacy on a cell phone is the same expectation of privacy as a home. In other words, that you do in fact need a search warrant to be able to identify information and retrieve information from a cell phone. However, the cell phone industry, as you know, they've gotten better at what they do, and one of those things is that they now have codes that allow you to put in a 4 or 5 digit code to be able to access your cell phone, or facial recognition. And so some of the courts are saying that the access to the cell phone through those means does not have the same expectation of privacy as the sort of traditional way of accessing a cell phone. So it's likely going to go back to the Supreme Court to render an opinion at some point.
Interesting. So this is a situation that is different than what has already been decided law.
Yes, and some people are interpreting that as such. In other words, it's sort of like, well, if you've got a text message that pops up on the screen that the officer is able to see, and
we have you, Dr. Alex Del Carmen. Oh, okay. We just lost his signal, so we're going to check back in with him. And hearing him talk about this, it then also makes me think once again about what we just passed that's getting ready to go into effect on July 1st with the texting while driving as a primary offense in Florida yet again. Part of my argument for that being little more than just kind of a feel-good measure is that ultimately law enforcement wouldn't have any way to prove it. Okay, we do have Dr. Alex Del Carmen again. I'm sorry, Dr. Del Carmen, if you could just pick up where you left off and telling us that it wasn't necessarily settled law yet.
Right. So at the end of the day, the law was very clear until technology sort of advanced to the point of whether or not the officers are able to access the cell phone through those codes and through facial recognition. So now the question has come up as to whether or not the expectation is the same. Most legal scholars are saying that in fact it is the same, that the cell phone still requires a warrant from a police officer, and that you as a citizen, you have the right to be able to tell an officer, no, I do not want you to access the cell phone. In this particular case in Florida, we saw that the young man basically refused twice. Once initially, and the second time when the actual search warrant was produced, and as a consequence of that, he spent over 40 days in jail, but never turned the phone over to law enforcement. So it's kind of interesting to see how all of this is going to pan out throughout the United States.
It is. So let me ask you a different but related question. In Florida, we just passed in the state sessions, getting ready to take effect July 1st, texting while driving as a primary offense. Now, my argument for this being little more than a feel-good law is that there's no way for law enforcement to be able to prove you're texting while driving. If they wanted to go along with a reckless driving type of charge, okay, but they could do that without texting while driving being a primary offense, and that's what they would have to lean on. So is that really the case, or is there something I'm missing here?
So, maybe, right? But then the other side of that is technology has helped law enforcement now be able to put a person in a car. For instance, you've got now mechanisms that like a black box equivalent in a vehicle that you could actually record when the car was on, how fast it traveled, and where it went to, and then cell phone towers that will actually be able to pin and recognize whether the person is actually texting or not. So at the end of the day, although probably in the next couple of years that technology is not available to law enforcement in Florida, I bet you money that in 5 years or 6 years from now, there will be devices that will allow law enforcement to know if your cell phone texting component is activated while your car is being driven.
Wow. All right. That's really compelling. And that does make me wonder if that wasn't part of the reason that things got pushed and passed now, was an eye towards the future. Great stuff. Really good information. Appreciate you taking the time with us. Dr. Alex Del Carmen, law enforcement expert. Things that make you go,